Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we begin a gentle and cozy retelling of Anne of Green Gables. Episode 1, Mrs. Rachel is Surprised. Let's begin. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived where the Avonlea road dipped softly into a hollow, as though the road itself had grown tired of climbing and wished for a little while to rest among the alders. There, beneath the green shade and the delicate nodding blossoms people called ladies' eardrops, a brook slipped through the hollow on its way from old Cuthbert Woods. Far back among those trees, it had been a livelier, more secretive little stream, hurrying over stones, hiding itself in pools, and whispering under fern-fringed banks. By the time it reached Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door, it had become a well-behaved brook, clear and orderly, with no more fuss than what was proper. That was just as well, for very little could pass through Lynde's hollow without being observed. Mrs. Rachel's kitchen window looked toward the main road, and from that window she saw nearly everything worth seeing, as well as a great many things that other people might never have thought worth seeing at all. Children on errands, wagons going to Carmody, strangers passing through, neighbors driving out at odd hours, even the drifting habits of weather, and livestock. These things all came beneath Miss Rachel's notice. If something appeared out of place, she didn't frown and let it go. She held it in mind, turning it over carefully, and waited until she had found the reason for it. She was a capable woman, and Avonlea knew it. There were those who watched their neighbors because of their own affairs had slipped loose at the edges, but Mrs. Rachel was not one of them. Her own house was kept in excellent order. Her work was finished when it ought to be finished, and often before. She was active in the sewing circle, useful at Sunday school, dependable in church matters, and firm where committees required firmness. Yet somehow, after all that, she still found time to sit long stretches at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts and keeping one thoughtful eye upon the road. By early June, the world outside that window was especially pleasant to look upon. The sun came in warm and steady, laying a brightness across the floorboards and touching the edges of Miss Rachel's knitting needles whenever they flashed in her hands. Down the slope beneath the house, the orchard stood in a pale bridal cloud of pink and white bloom, with bees moving throughout it in a low, contented murmur. Beyond the barn, Thomas Lynde was at work sowing late turnip seed, quiet and mild as always, going about the task with the patient air of a man who had long ago accepted that his wife saw farther and faster than he did. Across the fields, though not in sight from the window, Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been doing the very same thing at Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew this because she made it her business to know such matters, and also because she had heard Matthew say so himself the evening before at William J. Blair's store in Carmody. Or rather, she had heard him answer when Peter Morrison asked him. Matthew Cuthbert was not a man who offered information of his own accord. He was shy to the bone, quiet in company, and so uneasy among strangers that a trip away from home was, for him, no small undertaking. If Matthew said he meant to sow turnip seeds the next afternoon, then sow turnip seed he almost certainly would. And yet, at 3:30, on that same busy afternoon, Mrs. Rachel saw him drive down into the hollow and begin the climb up the hill road. Her needles paused. Matthew was dressed in his best suit. That alone would have been enough to make Mrs. Rachel sit a little straighter. But there was more. He wore a white collar, which he never did for ordinary farm business, and he had the buggy out, with the sorrel mare between the shafts. A man did not put on a white collar and take the buggy merely to go borrowing seed from a neighbor. Nor did Matthew Cuthbert, of all men, dress himself so carefully unless he was going somewhere well beyond the comfortable boundaries of his usual life. Mrs. Rachel watched until the buggy had passed beyond the hollow and the sound of its wheels had grown faint on the red road. Then she looked down at her knitting, but the pattern had lost its satisfaction. Her hands went for a few stitches, faithful from the habit, while her mind followed Matthew up the hill out of Avonlea. Where could he be going? Had it been almost any other man, she might have shaped a sensible guess within minutes. There were errands in town, visits to relatives, calls for doctors, business at the store, all ordinary reasons by which ordinary men explain themselves. But Matthew rarely visited, almost never went among strangers, and would sooner let another man do the talking if there was talking to be done. He had not been driving quickly enough for a doctor. If he had needed more turnip seed, he would not have taken the buggy. And if he were merely going to Carmody on a small matter, there was still the white collar to account for. By the time the buggy had fully disappeared, Mrs. Rachel's afternoon peace had gone with it. She sat for a while longer, the June light resting warmly around her, the bees moving softly among the blossoms, Thomas Lynde sowing in the field as though nothing in the world had altered. But something had altered. Matthew Cuthbert had gone out of Avonlea dressed for importance, and no explanation had been provided. At last, Mrs. Rachel drew a firm breath and settled the matter in her own mind. After tea, she would step up to the Green Gables and ask Marilla. The Cuthbert place was not far at all, only a scant quarter-mile down the road, though the long lane made it feel tucked away from the rest of the world. Until then, there was nothing to do but knit and wonder. The lane to Green Gables lay a little apart from the rest of Avonlea, turning in from the main road with a quiet, unassuming bend, and then stretching inward toward banks of grass and wild rose bushes that had grown freely over the years. It was not a grand approach, nor particularly well kept, but it had a settled look, as though it had long ago decided its purpose, and saw no need to change. Mrs. Rachel Lynde walked it briskly, her thoughts keeping pace with her steps. The afternoon light had begun to soften, though the warmth still lingered pleasantly in the air, and the scent of blossoms drifted faintly along the lane. She noticed these things, as she noticed most things, but they did not hold her attention long. Her mind was occupied. Green Gables had never suited her idea of proper living. It stood too far back from the road, half hidden by trees, as though it preferred not to be seen. Matthew Cuthbert's father had chosen the place with a kind of deliberate distance from the rest of Avonlea, clearing his land at the very edge of where the settlement met the lingering wildness of the woods and the stream. The house itself, with its gables peeking through the orchard branches, seemed tucked away from the natural movement of neighbors and visitors alike. Mrs. Rachel had often said that such a place was not living at all. "It's just staying, that's what," she remarked, now under her breath, as her shoes pressed into the worn ruts of the lane. "No wonder Matthew and Marilla are a little odd, living off here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though there's enough of them if anybody had a mind for it. I'd sooner see people passing now and then." She moved along the lane, the roses brushing faintly at her skirts, the lane curving gently ahead. "To be sure, they seem contented," she went on, her tone softening slightly, though not enough to alter her conclusion. "But then, folks get used to most anything. Even the strangest ways begin to feel natural after a time." The lane opened at last into the yard at Green Gables. It was a very green yard, neat in a way that spoke less of show and more of habit. Great willow trees stood on one side, their branches trailing lightly, while on the other side of a row of Lombardy poplars rose straight and orderly against the sky. The grass was trimmed, the paths clear, and not a stray twig or stone lay where it didn't belong. There was a sense of quiet precision about it, as though every part of the place had been attended to, without fuss, and then left alone to remain so. Mrs. Rachel paused only long enough to take it all in, though, in truth, she had already taken it in countless times before. Marilla Cuthbert kept a yard that reflected her nature, exact, steady, and thoroughly reliable. One might have set a small meal down anywhere upon the ground without fear of untidiness, and Mrs. Rachel privately approved of that, even if she did not say so out loud. She went directly to the kitchen door and rapped upon it, brisk and certain. There was no delay in answer. Mrs. Rachel entered as soon as she was bid. Inside, the kitchen held the same careful order as the yard. It was bright, with the gentle glow of June light coming through the west window, falling across the floor and touching the edges of the table that had already been laid for supper. There was nothing careless in the arrangement. Every dish stood in its place, every chair aligned, every surface clear and clean to a degree that might have seemed excessive in another household. It was a cheerful room, and yet there was something restrained about it, as though it had been kept so well that it had forgotten how to relax. At the far side of the room, near the window that looked outward toward the orchard, sat Marilla Cuthbert. She held her knitting in her hands, though she didn't seem hurried about it, and the light caught the smooth line of her profile as she turned slightly at Mrs. Rachel's entrance. Marilla was a tall, spare woman, her figure straight and composed, her dark hair drawn tightly back and fastened with the efficiency that left no strand out of place. There were a few threads of gray among it now, though they didn't soften her expression. Her face carried the look of one accustomed to order and responsibility, and there was a firmness in that didn't easily yield. Yet, there was also something quieter there, something that didn't immediately show itself, but could be glimpsed if one watched closely enough. "Good evening, Rachel," she said, her voice even and composed. "It's a fine evening. Won't you sit down? How are your folks?" Mrs. Rachel accepted the chair offered, though she did not sit in it idly. Her eyes had already moved, taking in the table, the plates, the small details that spoke more plainly than words. 3 plates. That was enough to set her thoughts turning again. Everything else was ordinary enough. Everyday dishes, simple fare, nothing to suggest special company. But the 3rd place remained, quiet and unmistakable. "We're all quite well," Miss Rachel replied, folding her hands for a moment before letting them rest again. "Though, I must say, I was a bit concerned when I saw Matthew driving off this afternoon. It's not like him to be going about in such a way. I couldn't help but wonder if something had happened." Marilla's knitting paused, just for an instant, before resuming with steady precision. "Oh no, nothing of the sort," she said. "I had a headache yesterday, but it's passed. Matthew has gone to Bright River." Mrs. Rachel waited, expecting the rest to follow. When it did not, she leaned forward ever so slightly. "To Bright River?" she repeated. "Yes, we're to have a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia. He's coming on the train tonight." The words settled into the room without haste, as plainly spoken as any ordinary piece of news. Mrs. Rachel did not stir at first answer. For a moment, she sat very still, as though the meaning had not quite reached her. It was not that she doubted Marilla's sincerity. Marilla was not a woman given to jokes, but the idea itself seemed so entirely unexpected that it refused at first to arrange itself into sense. Had Marilla said that Matthew had gone to fetch something rare or improbable, it could have scarcely have surprised her more. At last, Mrs. Rachel found her voice again. "Are you quite in earnest, Marilla?" she asked. "Yes, of course," Marilla said, in a tone so matter-of-fact that it seemed to leave no room at all for doubt or reconsideration. She didn't look up from her knitting as she spoke, but her needles moved with the same steady certainty as before, clicking softly in the quiet kitchen. To her, the matter appeared already decided, arranged, and set into motion, like any other practical undertaking that had been carefully thought through and carried out. Mrs. Rachel, however, felt as though the ground beneath her understanding had just shifted. A boy. The thought settled over her, then rose again, sharper the second time. A boy from an orphan asylum, brought all the way from Nova Scotia. To Green Gables of all places. To Matthew and Marilla, who had lived their lives in such steady, predictable ways that one might have thought them incapable of sudden change. She drew in a breath, though it did not quite steady her. "What on earth put such a notion into your head?" she asked, her voice firm, though not unkind. There was a certain duty, as she saw it, in asking such questions plainly. Matter of this sort were not to be passed over with mild remarks and polite nodding. Marilla did not seem offended. She had expected the question, perhaps, even prepared for it. "Well, we've been thinking about it for some time," she replied. "All winter, in fact." She paused long enough to adjust her yarn, her gaze briefly lowering as though she were following the thread of her own explanation. "Mrs. Alexander Spencer was here before Christmas," she continued, "and she told us she meant to get a little girl from the asylum at Hopetown this spring. Her cousin lives there and knows how such things are arranged. After that, Matthew and I spoke of it now and again. It seemed a sensible idea." "Sensible," Miss Rachel repeated, though the word did not sit easily with her. Marilla's tone remained composed, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it now, as though she were laying out her reasoning one careful piece at a time. "Matthew is getting older," she said. "He's not as strong as he once was, and his heart troubles him more than he likes to say. You know how difficult it is to find help these days. The boys that come are not reliable, and when you do manage to teach one his work, he's off again before long, chasing wages somewhere else." The kitchen held its quiet order while she spoke, the late light resting softly along the table and the window frame. Mrs. Rachel listened, though her expression remained doubtful. "At first," Marilla went on, "Matthew suggested we might take a homeboy, but I was not inclined to that. I felt we ought to have a child born and brought up closer to our own ways. There is always some risk, of course, no matter who you take in, but I thought I would feel easier knowing something of where he came from." Mrs. Rachel's lips pressed tightly together, though she didn't interrupt. "So we sent word to Mrs. Spencer," Marilla said. "When we heard she was going, we asked her to choose a boy for us, about 10 or 11, old enough to be of use and young enough to be trained properly. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. It seemed, on the whole, the right thing to do." She spoke the last word simply, without emphasis, as though they required none. Mrs. Rachel sat very still for a moment, absorbing all that had been said. It was a great deal to take in, and none of it fit neatly within her understanding of how such matters ought to be managed. At last, she drew herself up slightly. "Well, Marilla," she said, with a certain deliberate clarity, "I'll just tell you plain what I think. I believe you are doing a very foolish thing." Marilla's needles did not falter, but there was a slight stillness in her posture, as though she were listening more closely now. "It's a risky business, that's what it is," Miss Rachel continued. "You don't know what you're getting. Bringing a strange child into your house, your home, without knowing anything of his people, or what sort of disposition he may have, or how he's been brought up. There's no telling how such a thing may turn out." Her voice had not risen, but it carried a steady weight of conviction. "Why, only last week I read in the paper," she went on, "of a family that took in a boy from an asylum, and he set fire to the house in the night. Set it on purpose, Marilla. They were fortunate to escape as they did." The words lingered in the air for a moment after she finished. Outside, the quiet of the June evening went on undisturbed. The orchard beyond the window stirred gently in the light breeze. and somewhere in the distance, a bird called, its note soft and unhurried. Marilla laid her knitting in her lap at last. She didn't answer at once, but when she lifted her head, there was no agitation in her expression, only a calm, steady resolve that had been there all along, though perhaps not so plainly seen until now. "We've considered that," she said. "We're not acting without thought, Rachel." Her voice was even, but there was a quiet strength in it that did not invite argument so much as withstand it. "We believe it is the right thing for us to do," she added. Mrs. Rachel regarded her closely, as though weighing the firmness of that decision. It was not easy to move Marilla once her mind was set, and that fact, more than anything, gave Mrs. Rachel pause. Still, she was not entirely satisfied. "But you don't know anything about the child," she said again, though with less sharpness than before. "No," Marilla answered. "Not yet." There was something in the way she said it, not careless, not uncertain, but simply accepting, that quieted the room more than any argument might have done. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The light had shifted further now, softening toward evening. The third plate remained set upon the table, waiting in its place, as it too were part of a decision that had already been made and could not easily be undone. And somewhere, beyond Avonlea, the train that would bring the child nearer had already begun its journey. Mrs. Rachel's words came in on steady stream, as though once begun they could not easily be brought to a stop. She spoke with conviction, drawing upon every cautionary tale she had ever heard, and a few she seemed to recall more vividly in telling than they may have appeared at first hearing. Her concern was genuine, though it carried with it the firm belief that she saw matters more clearly than those around her. "And I know another case," she continued, leaning forward slightly, her voice lowered but no less certain, "where a boy that was taken in developed the most peculiar habits. Quite impossible to correct, they said. One of them had taken to slipping into the hen house and drinking the eggs straight from the shell, and they couldn't break him of it, not of all their trying. It only shows you never know what you're bringing into your home when you take a child from such a place. If you had asked my advice, which you did not, Marilla, I would have said, for your own peace of mind, not to think of such a thing at all." She settled back a little after this, as though satisfied that she had spoken plainly and thoroughly. Marilla listened without interruption. Her knitting didn't falter, and there was nothing in her expression to suggest that she was either offended or persuaded. The quiet click of her needles went on, steady as the ticking of a clock, marking the passage of the moment, without haste. "I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel," she replied at last. "I've my own doubts, but Matthew was very much set upon it." She spoke Matthew's name with a certain weight, as though that alone explained more than any further argument might have done. "It's not often he takes to a notion to anything in particular," she went on, "and when he does, I found it best to consider it carefully. He felt so strongly about this, and I could see the reason of it." Mrs. Rachel made a small sound that might have meant agreement, or might not. "As for the risks," Marilla continued, her tone even, "there are risks in most things. People have children of their own, and they do not always turn out as expected. One cannot be entirely certain of outcomes, no matter how one begins." She paused, resting her hands briefly before resuming her knitting. "And Nova Scotia is not so far away," she added. "It isn't as though the child were coming from a place wholly unlike our own. He can't be so different." Mrs. Rachel considered this, though it did not altogether satisfy her. "Well," she said after a moment, "I do hope it turns out all right. But don't say I didn't warn you if something goes amiss. There are things that happen, strange things, and not always where one expects them." Marilla inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the warning without comment. "We'll do what we can," she said simply. The matter, for the moment, seemed to have reached its natural pause. Outside, The light had softened further, the long afternoon easing toward evening. A faint breeze stirred the leaves beyond the window, and the quiet of Green Gables settled in around the house as it always did, steady and undisturbed. Mrs. Rachel rose at last, smoothing her skirt with a small, decisive motion. "I suppose I should be going," she said. "It's getting on, and there's still the walk home." Marilla set aside her knitting and stood as well. "You're welcome to stay for tea," she offered. Mrs. Rachel hesitated, though not long. The thought of lingering held some appeal, particularly with the expectation of Matthew's return and the arrival of the child. But there was also the matter of the news itself, newly acquired and waiting to be considered, and perhaps, in due course, to be shared. "No, I think I'll go on," she said. "I've heard quite enough for one afternoon." Marilla didn't press her. They moved toward the door together, the kitchen returning to its quiet order behind them. The third place at the table remained, unchanged, waiting for the evening to unfold. Mrs. Rachel stepped out into the yard once more, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of grass and blossoms. She paused for a moment, looking back at the house with the expression that held both doubt and curiosity. "Well, of all things," she murmured, almost to herself. "A child at Green Gables." The ideal still refused to settle comfortably in her mind. She turned and made her way down the lane, her steps a little slower than before, though her thoughts moved quickly enough. There was much to consider, and more still to be said. The news she carried seemed to gather weight the further she went, as though it would not be content to remain unspoken. "I must be dreaming," she said softly as she walked. "It hardly seems possible." The wild roses brushed against her skirts again as she passed, and the evening light lingered gently along the path. Yet even in such calm surroundings, her thoughts ran on. "I do feel sorry for the child," she added after a moment. "Matthew and Marilla don't know much about children. They'll expect him to be steady and sensible right from the start. It's a great deal to expect of anyone, let alone a boy from an orphan asylum." She shook her head slightly, though there was something softer in her expression now. "It's a strange thing altogether," she went on. "There's never been a child at Green Gables. It doesn't seem the place for one." The lane opened back toward the main road, and the hollow lay before her once more, quiet and familiar. "If I were in that child's place," she said thoughtfully, "I wouldn't know what to make of it." Her voice faded into the stillness as she continued on. Behind her, Green Gables stood as it always had, composed and orderly, waiting for the evening to bring what it would. And far beyond Avonlea, at a small station where the tracks ran quiet between fields and trees, a child waited, patient and alone, for someone who had not yet arrived. Matthew Cuthbert drove steadily along the road to Bright River, the sorrel mare keeping an even, unhurried pace, as though she understood there was no need for haste. The afternoon had settled into that gentle hour when the light softens without quiet fading, and the land seems to rest in itself. The road wound between farmsteads that sat comfortably among their fields, with stretches of woodland now and then, where the air grew cooler and carried the faint, resin-sweet scent of fir. In low places, wild plum trees stood in pale bloom, their branches lightly stirred by the passing breeze. Farther off, the land opened into meadows that sloped toward a horizon touched with distant color, soft and indistinct. Matthew noticed these things in a quiet way. He always did. He enjoyed a drive, provided it asked nothing of him. At times, however, the road would bring him face to face with another traveler, and then he must lift his head and give that expected nod. This was a small courtesy, but not an easy one for Matthew. When the traveler was a man, it passed simply enough. When it was a woman, he felt at once uncertain of himself, as though he had been placed in a situation for which he had not been properly prepared for. Matthew was not at ease with women. He did not dislike them, nor did he think ill of them, but there was something in their presence that made him feel awkward and exposed, as though they saw more than he wished to show. Only Marilla and Mrs. Rachel were exceptions to this discomfort, and even with them, he was never entirely free of it. So he was glad when the road grew quiet and he could settle back into his own thoughts, or into the absence of them. By the time he reached Bright River, the station yard lay calm and nearly empty. There was no sign of a train, and Matthew, concluding that he must have arrived too early, tied the mare and made his way toward the platform. It stretched out before him in a long, quiet line, with only the faint sounds of evening settling over the place. At the far end, seated upon a pile of shingles, was a child. Matthew noticed this, without first taking particular note of it. He was accustomed to not looking closely at strangers, unless there was some reason to do so. He passed along the platform with a careful, sidelong awareness, meaning to attend to his errand, and nothing more. The child did not move. There was something in the stillness of that small figure, something attentive, waiting, that might have drawn a second glance from a less hesitant man. But Matthew, uncertain of how to behave in the presence of strangers, kept his eyes forward and went on. Inside, he found a station master, just as he was preparing to leave. Matthew removed his hat. "Will the 5:30 train be along soon?" he asked. The station master looked at him with mild surprise. "It's been and gone," he said. "Came in half an hour ago." Matthew blinked. "But there was a passenger for you," the man added. "A little girl. She's out there now, sitting on the shingles. I told her she might wait inside, but she preferred to stay out. Said there was more to see." Matthew stood very still. "A girl," he said. "That's what I said," returned the station master. "Came off with Mrs. Spencer. She told me that you and your sister were to take the child. That is all I know about it." Matthew's hand tightened slightly around the brim of his hat. "I was expecting a boy," he said. The station master gave a short, indifferent shrug. "Well, you best ask her about it," he said. "She'll likely tell you all there is to tell." And with that, he went on his way, leaving Matthew alone in the quiet station. For a moment, Matthew didn't move. A girl. The word seemed to settle into his thoughts without quite finding a place to rest. He turned slowly and made his way back to the platform. The child was still there, sitting exactly as before, her posture straight and intent, as though she had been waiting not only patiently, but with her whole being. She had seen him now. He could feel that much without looking directly, and there was something in that awareness that made his steps falter, just slightly. Matthew Cuthbert, who would rather have faced almost any difficulty of field or weather, found himself at a loss before the simple act of approaching a child, especially a girl. He moved forward at last, quietly, as though careful not to disturb the stillness of the moment, and as he drew nearer, the waiting came to meet him. Matthew had taken the small, thin hand in his own before he had quite decided to do so, and once he had, the matter seemed settled in a way that required no further thought. He could not bring himself to explain the mistake, right there on that quiet platform, not to this child whose eyes were so bright with expectation. It seemed kinder and far simpler to say nothing for now. He would take her home. Marilla would know what to do. "I'm sorry I was late," he said, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. "Come along. The horse is over in the yard. Let me carry your bag." "Oh, I can carry it," the child answered quickly, drawing it closer to her. "It isn't heavy. All my things are in it, but it isn't heavy at all. And the handle has a way of coming loose if it isn't held just so, so I'd better keep it. I know the exact way to carry it." She spoke with cheerful certainty, as though she had already arranged every small difficulty into something manageable. "It's a very old carpet bag," she added, almost thoughtfully, "but I'm fond of it." Matthew didn't insist. He nodded and turned toward the yard, and she came along beside him, without hesitation. "I'm very glad you came," she said again, as though the thought had been waiting to be said twice. "Even if I had quite made up my mind what I should do if you didn't. I was going to climb up that cherry tree and stay there for the night. It would have been beautiful, with the moon shining through the blossoms. But this is nicer, I think." Matthew listened, though he did not know quite how to answer. "We've got a long drive, haven't we?" she continued. "Mrs. Spencer said it was 8 miles. I'm glad of that, because I do like driving. It gives me time to think and to imagine." They had reached the buggy now. Matthew helped her up carefully, and she settled herself with a small, contented movement, placing her bag beside her and folding her hands for a moment, as though she meant to sit quietly. That lasted only a moment. "It seems so wonderful," she said softly, "that I'm going to live with you. I've never belonged to anyone before." "Not really." The words were spoken simply, but something in them lingered. "The asylum was the worst," she went on, though not bitterly, only as one stating a fact. "I was there for only 4 months, but that was enough. There isn't much to imagine there. That's the trouble. There's so little scope for imagination in an asylum." Matthew clucked gently to the mare, and the buggy moved forward. "But I used to imagine things about the other children," she continued, her voice gaining warmth again. "I used to think perhaps the girl sitting next to me might really be the daughter of a great nobleman, stolen away when she was small. It made things more interesting. I used to lie awake at night and think of all sorts of stories. That's why I'm so thin, I suppose. Thinking takes up a good deal of strength." She glanced at him with a quick, earnest look. "I am very thin, aren't I?" she said. "But I like to imagine I'm plump, with dimples in my elbows." Matthew gave a small, uncertain sound that might have been agreement. They drove on for a little while in a quieter way, the village falling behind them as the road dipped and curved between the banks of the soft earth and the growing trees. The evening light had grown gentler still, touching the tops of the branches and slipping through the leaves in narrow, shining threads. The child reached out suddenly and caught at a branch that brushed near the buggy, breaking off a spray of white bloom. "Isn't that beautiful?" she said, holding it up. "What does it make you think of?" Matthew glanced at it. "Well now, I don't know," he said. "Why, it looks like a bride," she said, her eyes brightening. "All in white, with a veil. I've never seen a bride, but I can imagine exactly how she would look. I don't suppose I shall ever be one, but I should like to wear a white dress some day, just once." She turned the blossoms in her hands as though considering them from every angle. "I love pretty clothes," she added. "I've never had any, not that I can remember. But that only makes it nicer to imagine them, doesn't it? When you imagine things, you can make them exactly how you like." Matthew listened, and though he said very little, something in the steady flow of her voice seemed to ease him. "When we were coming over," she went on, "I felt quite ashamed of this dress. All the children had to wear them, you know. But I imagined I had on a pale blue silk dress with a hat covered in flowers and gloves and everything. It made the journey much more pleasant." The road stretched ahead, red and winding. "Oh, the roads here are so red," she said suddenly. "When we first saw them, I asked Mrs. Spencer what made them that color, and she said she didn't know and begged me not to ask any more questions. But how can you find out things if you don't ask questions?" Matthew considered this. "Well now, I don't know," he said again. She seemed perfectly satisfied with that. "There are so many things to find out," she said. "Isn't it wonderful to think of it? It makes me feel glad to be alive. If everything were known already, there wouldn't be any room for imagination, would there?" She paused, just long enough to draw a breath. "But am I talking too much?" she asked suddenly. "People often tell me I do. If you'd rather I didn't, I can stop. I truly can, if I make up my mind." Matthew looked at her, startled. "Oh, no," he said. "You can talk." And he found, to his quiet surprise, that he meant it. He had never expected to enjoy the company of a child, at least of all, a talkative one. But there was something in her voice, so full of interest and gentle eagerness, that made the road seem shorter and the evening somehow lighter. The buggy rode on toward Avonlea, the soft rhythm of the horse's steps carrying them forward, while beside him the child spoke of all things that she saw and imagined, weaving them together into something that was not quite the world as it was, but not entirely different from it either. Matthew listened in a quiet, almost wondering way as the child's words continued, flowing easily from one thought into the next without strain or hesitation. There was something lively in her speech, something bright and quick, as though her mind moved faster than most and simply carried her voice along with it. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked the sound of it. "Oh, you can talk as much as you like," he said at last, with a shy earnestness. "I don't mind." The child's face lit at once. "Oh, I'm so glad," she said. "I believe you and I are going to get along splendidly. It's such a comfort to talk when one wants, and not to be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me so often, I could say it along with them." She settled a little more comfortably in her seat, encouraged now. "And people laugh at me because I use big words," she went on. "But if one has big ideas, one must use big words to express them. Mustn't one?" "Well now," said Matthew, after a moment's consideration, "that seems reasonable." She accepted this with satisfaction. "Mrs. Spencer said my tongue must be hung in the middle," she continued with a hint of amusement. "But it isn't. It's fastened quite firmly at one end. She told me all about Green Gables, though, and I asked her everything I could think of. She said there were trees all around it, and I was so glad, because I do love trees." Her tone softened a little. "There weren't any at the asylum," she said. "Only a few poor little things out front, all boxed up in little white enclosures. They looked as though they felt just as shut in as we did. I used to feel quite sorry for them." She paused, looking out over the passing landscape. "I used to imagine what it would be like if they were growing in a great wood," she said, more quietly now, "with moss about their roots and a brook running nearby and birds singing in their branches. Then they could grow properly." She turned back again toward him. "Is there a brook near Green Gables?" she asked. "I meant to ask Mrs. Spencer, but I forgot." "Well now, yes," said Matthew. "There's one just below the house." "Fancy," she said softly. "I've always wished to live near a brook. I never truly expected I should, though it doesn't seem as if such things really happen. But now they have." She lifted one of her long braids and brought it forward, holding it up with a sudden shift in the mood. "What color would you call this?" she asked. Matthew glanced at it. "It's red," he said with simple certainty. She let the braid fall again with a small, resigned sigh. "Yes, it is." There was a brief silence, and then she continued in a tone that carried both seriousness and a touch of drama. "That is why I can't be perfectly happy," she said. "Nobody with red hair can be. I don't mind the freckles so much, or my eyes, or being thin. I can imagine those different, but I cannot imagine away red hair." She shook her head slightly. "I do try," she added. "I imagine it black, glossy, and beautiful, but it never quite stays that way. It always comes back red again." Matthew shifted slightly in his seat, unsure of how to respond, but not wishing to interrupt her. "I read once of a girl whose hair was like gold," she continued thoughtfully. "It rippled back from her forehead in the most beautiful way. I don't know exactly what alabaster means, but her brow was alabaster too. I should like to know what that is." Matthew gave a faint, helpless smile. "Well now, I'm afraid I can't tell you that," he said. She seemed to consider this without disappointment. "It must be something very nice," she said, "because she was described as beautiful." She looked ahead again, thoughtful, for a moment. "Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to be very beautiful?" she asked. "Well, no, said Matthew honestly. "I have," she said, "often, but I can never decide whether it would be better to be beautiful or clever or very good. I suppose it doesn't matter much, because it isn't likely I shall be of any of them." Before Matthew could attempt an answer, her voice changed suddenly, brightened, sharpened with delight. "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert!" The buggy had turned a gentle curve in the road, and the change before them was quiet, but striking. They had entered a long avenue where the branches of the apple trees arched overhead, meeting and mingling to form a soft green canopy. The light filtered through in shifting patterns, dappling the road beneath them, while blossoms, white and faintly pink, drifted in the air like something between petals and snow. The road itself seemed to lead them forward into a space set apart from the ordinary world. This is beautiful," she breathed. Her voice had gone very still now, filled not with chatter, but with wonder. Matthew, who had driven this way many times, glanced up at the trees with a new awareness, as though seeing them for the first time through her eyes. They moved slowly beneath the arching branches, the quiet deepening around them, until even the sound of the buggy wheels seemed softened. And for a little while, neither of them spoke. They moved on beneath the arching trees, and for a time the world seemed made only of soft light and drifting blossom. The branches met high overhead, woven together so closely that the sky showed only in quiet fragments, pale and distant beyond the white bloom. The air carried a faint sweetness, warm and full, as though the day itself had settled gently into evening. The child sat very still. The lively stream of her voice had fallen silent, not from the weariness, but from something deeper. She leaned back against the seat, her small hands folded loosely before her, her face lifted toward the canopy above as though she were listening to something that could not quite be heard. Matthew glanced at her once or twice, then looked ahead again, allowing the quiet to remain. It suited them both. Even when they passed out from underneath the trees and the road opened again, she didn't speak. The light had changed beyond the avenue. It was softer now, tinged with the colors of the coming dusk, and far ahead the sky held a faint glow, like something remembered rather than seen. They drove on in silence through the village of Newbridge, where the sounds of ordinary life rose briefly around them. Voices, a dog barking, a door closing somewhere, but none of it seemed to reach her. She remained still, her gaze turned outward, as though she were seeing not what lay before her, but something far beyond it. It was not until she had gone some distance past the village that Matthew, feeling the length of her quiet, spoke. "I guess you're feeling pretty tired and hungry," he said gently. "But we haven't far to go now, only another mile." She stirred at once, as though called back from a long way off, and turned toward him with a soft, wondering expression still lingering in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert," she said, her voice hushed. "That place we came through, that white place, what was it?" "Well now," said Matthew, after a moment's thought, "that would be the avenue. It's what folks call it." "The avenue?" she repeated slowly. "Oh, that doesn't seem the right name for it." She placed one hand lightly against her chest, as though steadying the feeling that had not quite left her. "It was something more than pretty," she went on, "and more than beautiful, too. Those words don't go far enough. It was wonderful. It's the first thing I ever saw that couldn't be made any better by imagining it. It just was." She drew in a small breath. "It gave me such a curious feeling," she said. "Not exactly a happy feeling, and not exactly a sad one. It was like a little ache, but a pleasant ache. Did you ever feel like that?" Matthew considered. "Well now, I can't say that I have," he answered. "I do," she said simply, "whenever I see something very lovely." She was quiet for a moment, then brightened again, though her voice remained soft. "They shouldn't call it the avenue," she said. "There's no meaning in that at all. It ought to have a name that sounds like what it is. I shall call it the White Way of Delight." She nodded as though settling the matter. Yes, that suits it perfectly. I always like to give things names that fit them properly. There was a girl at the asylum whose name was Hepzibah Jenkins, but I always imagined her as a Rosalia de Vere. It made a great difference. She turned slightly toward Matthew again. Have we really only another mile to go? She asked. I'm glad, and I'm sorry. I'm always sorry when pleasant things come to an end, though sometimes something even pleasanter comes afterward, but I can't be sure. Her voice softened again. I'm glad to think of going to a real home, she said. I've never had one that I can remember. It gives me that pleasant ache, just thinking of it. The road rose gently before them, and the buggy climbed the crest of a hill. Beyond it, the land opened wide. Below lay a long, winding stretch of water, smooth as glass and catching the last colors of the sky. A narrow bridge crossed it, and beyond, the water curved away toward the distant sandhills, pale against the deepening blue. The surface shimmered with the shifting hues, soft rose, faint violet, a touch of green where the shadows gathered, colors that seemed to change even as they were seen. Trees leaned along its edges, their reflections wavering gently, while from somewhere unseen came the low, steady chorus of frogs. Matthew lifted his hand slightly. That's Barry's Pond, he said. The child leaned forward with eyes widening. Oh, she said. I don't like that name at all. She considered only for a moment. I shall call it the Lake of Shining Waters, she said with quiet certainty. Yes, that is the right name. I know it is, because it gives me a little thrill to say it. She glanced at Matthew with bright curiosity. Do things ever give you a thrill? She asked. Matthew thought for a moment. Well now, yes, he said slowly. I suppose they do, though not quite the same way. I always feel something of it when I see white grubs turn up in the garden beds. I don't like the look of them at all. She looked at him thoughtfully. I don't think that can be quite the same sort of thrill, she said gently. But perhaps it is, in a way, only different. She turned her gaze back to the water, watching it as they began the slow descent toward the hill. And why do they call it Barry's Pond? She added. It doesn't suit it in the least. The buggy rolled on, the evening deepening softly around them, while the lake, her lake of shining waters, held the last light of day. I reckon it's called that because Mr. Barry lives up there, said Matthew. Orchard Slope is the name of his place. If it wasn't for that big bush, you could see the Green Gables from here. But we have to go over that bridge and around that road, so it's a bit farther. Does Mr. Barry have any girls? She asked quickly. About my size. He's got one about 11. Her name is Diana. Oh, she breathed, delighted. What a perfectly lovely name. Well now, I don't know, said Matthew. There's something a bit unusual about it. I'd rather Jane or Mary, but a schoolmaster named her. I wish there had been a schoolmaster like that when I was born, she said. Then suddenly, oh, the bridge. I'm going to shut my eyes. She squeezed them tight. I always imagined bridges might crumble right up in the middle, like a jackknife, so I shut my eyes. I always peek, because if it did happen, I'd want to see it. She cracked one eye open. Oh, I do love the rumble sound, though. Isn't it wonderful there are so many things to like? A moment later. There, we're over. She turned and looked back. Good night, Lake of Shining Waters, she said softly. I always say good night to the things I love, just like people. She watched the water. It looks like it's smiling at me. They drove on. After a little while, Matthew said, We're nearly home now. That's Green Gables. Oh, don't tell me, she said quickly, catching his arm. Let me guess. She opened her eyes and looked out. They were on a hill. The sky was soft with evening light. A church spire stood against the fading gold sky. Below was a quiet valley, and beyond it, a gentle slope with scattered homes. Her eyes moved searching, then stopped. Far back, among blossoming trees, stood a house, soft and pale in the twilight. Above it, a single bright star shone. "That's it, isn't it?" she said. Matthew gave a small nod. "Well now, you've guessed it." They turned into the yard, where the shadows had deepened and the poplar leaves whispered softly in the dark. "Listen," she said in a hushed voice. "The trees are talking in their sleep. What lovely dreams they must have." Matthew helped her down from the buggy. She held tightly to her little carpet bag, the one that carried all she owned, and followed him toward the house, her step light with hope. But Matthew lingered a moment. Something in him had gone quiet. All the way home, he had been putting it off, the words that would have to be said. He knew what waited inside, and he knew, too, what it would mean for her. For the first time that evening, the comfort of the drive slipped away from him, and in its place came a heavy, uneasy feeling that he couldn't shake. He turned at last and followed her in, and the light of the doorway closed softly behind them. And now, Green Gables grows quiet for the night. The road has settled behind them. The soft hush of evening has gathered along the fields, and beneath the darkening sky, the house waits, still and watchful. Inside, a light has been lit. A door has closed, and something unexpected has come to rest within its walls. A child has arrived. Not as planned, not as imagined, but here, nonetheless. And though the rooms remain just as they were this morning, something has shifted. Something small, something uncertain, something not yet understood. Beyond the windows, the trees whisper softly in the air. The brook moves quietly along its familiar path, and the world, unchanged, seems to be holding its breath. What has begun here is not yet clear, but it has begun. And when you return, we will follow it gently, one step at a time. For now, let the evening settle around you. Let the quiet of Green Gables grow soft and still. Let the road fade into distance. Let the house grow dim. And allow the story to rest here for tonight. You are safe. You are loved. And you have been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.